All right, my name is Corbin Lubert. I'm the head strength coach at Allegiant Gym South Bay, and this is Block 11's Ask Me Anything. First question starts off really hot and asks, are we really going to listen to the same band all month, and request that we please don't do that because it gets really old really fast. So with a lot of these questions this block, I'm going to request that you guys have a little bit more of a positive outlook when you are submitting your questions for these Ask Me Anythings, and just know that we have your best interests in mind. So when you say how quickly listening to the same band over and over and over again gets old fast, just imagine how the coaches feel when they're listening to the same band play hour after hour on shift, all during every single class. So if you're sick of it, just know how sick of it the coaches are. On top of that, we're all about building mental resiliency here at Allegiant, and this is just another way that we incorporate that into the program. So don't worry about the music. Worry about showing up 3 to 4 times a week, training hard, recovering hard, and reaching your goals. Second spicy question of Block 11 AMA asks about why we're using 90 seconds as the interval between sets for our A series and team. This person points out that with a 3-second eccentric and a 1-second concentric, that means at minimum a set for one person should take 40 seconds. If you were to get 3 people to a rack, that means that one set will take up to about 120 seconds if they don't rest at all at the top of a rep, or there's no changing of the weights or the plates in between people. So they are insinuating that we need more rest time per our 10 sets of 10. Again, we should really be more positive when we're submitting questions here and not just focus so much on the negative. I'd also like to congratulate the person who asked this question on practicing their times tables and figuring out that we needed a little bit more rest here. Now, when we write a program, one of the biggest things that we look at is trying to make sure that that program fits within the 60-minute time slot that we've allotted for that given class, which is why we opted to go with a 90-second window for each individual set on our German volume training 10 by 10. Now, classes have been finishing 5 to 10 minutes early depending on the given day. So we have elongated that rest period, or we're going to go every 2 minutes instead of every 90 seconds for our sets on German volume training. But it's really just because we found out that we had a little bit of extra time in class and we could afford to do so versus, hey, we really need that extra time. It's anytime we have something like that, it's just motivating to keep you guys on track, keep you guys rolling through the program so that we can get the most density out of those 60 minutes. Another question that we've had about our team class for the German volume training is about practice 2 with 10 by 10 on pull-up and how we should approach that. So one person started by asking if it's even doable, if there's anybody in the gym that can achieve that. And then another question asked, if there isn't somebody in the gym that can achieve that, what is our best way of attacking that practice 2? Do we just try to get as many reps as we can every set, or do we come in with kind of a game plan for how many reps per set we should do over those 10 sets, and how do we progress that week to week? So what we've been doing with the previous blocks, and this block included, is we always give an alternative to our prescription when we have this much volume on a movement like pull-ups or chin-ups. So if you look on the board, we've got the original prescription of 10 sets of 10, and then we've got a prescription down below it of 10 sets of 5. And it's always an alternative to just drop down to that 10 sets of 5. Now, something else that you could do, and we could look at this from a progressive overload point of view of, hey, last block we did 10 sets of 3. So you know whether you can or you can't do either 30 total pull-ups within a session, or if you can do 30 eccentric or 30 negative pull-ups within a session. So you kind of have a gauge right there on how successful you aren't going to be with 10 more sets on a wide neutral grip pull-up. And then from there, we can kind of plan out 4 weeks. So if, say, I got my 10 sets of 3 in last block, I know I can do 30 pull-ups, but I don't know if I could do 10 sets of 4 and up that to 40. Maybe I start week 1 with 10 sets of 3 again, and I see if I get my full 30. And then week 2, I progressively overload that so that I try to do 10 sets of 4. Say I only get 35. That's pretty good. I still got more reps overall than I did last block or week 1, And maybe it still gives me somewhere to go on week 3. However, it's not going every set till failure, maybe hitting 10 reps the first set, but then only hitting 5 or 4 or 3 or just negatives on sets 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and making it so that it's impossible for me to progress week to week and maybe not even survive to week 4. So that's probably the option I'd recommend versus just maxing out every single week. That's not something that we would do on our practice 1 when we're squatting. It's not something we would do on our practice 3 when we're doing deadlifts or RDLs. So it's not something I'd recommend trying to do with the pull-up. Have a little bit more of a plan of attack on how you're going to get through these 4 weeks. The last option would be using the lat pull down, which most of our members could probably get through 10 sets of 10 using that lat pull down, which is a really good option if you're getting up chin above the bar and you can't control that negative on the way down. If you're taking your feet off the barbell that's in front of you and you're just violently dropping into that dead hang, probably time to go over to that lat pull down. It's never going to be as efficient or effective in making you able to do more pull-ups, but it's a better option than not being able to control the movement when trying to do negatives hanging off the bar. My next question asks how to properly breathe through the B series exercises. So when we talk about breathing through workouts, there's a lot of different ways that we can look at it. So first of all, I'm going to make the assumption here that we're talking about the team program, in which case, once we finish our 10 by 10, my first suggestion would be to take 90 seconds, take 2 minutes, catch your breath after we come out of that 10 by 10. Try not to go straight into that B series. When we look at the likelihood of injury occurring, especially when we're tired, or the likelihood of injury occurring probably increases when we're tired. So we look at really simple things that we're probably not putting a lot of thought into, like when we get done with our 10 by 10 on a heels elevated front squat, and then we go into a toes elevated dumbbell RDL, just picking those dumbbells up off the ground. If we get really sloppy with that movement, that's where that kind of overuse or bending poorly through the spine can really lead to either chronic fatigue or chronic soreness in our vertebrae, or even maybe acute injury. So take a couple minutes, gather yourself after that A series, and then go ahead and collect your weights and start through the B series. Now, when we talk about breathing specifically, there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of look at this. Number one, a good kind of metrics to use, a good metric to use would be, can we maintain nasal breathing? So say I get done with my 10 sets of 10 on heels elevated front squat, and I am breathing completely through my mouth. I am totally gassed. If I'm in the South Bay, I'm out on the turf, laying on my back, just trying to collect myself, right? I think it's probably a good idea to stay there until we can regather control of our breath and maybe get all the way back to inhale through the nose, exhale through the nose, and not feel like we are in an oxygen deficit. So we're going to get there as fast as we can by just getting control of our breath in the first place. So if we're going in and out through the mouth, the next thing I want to do is focus on trying to go in through the nose, out through the mouth. And we're going to do that with something called power breathing. So sharp inhale, sharp exhale. And this can be fast and forceful. Until I feel like I can get control of that. Again, I'm not so in a need for oxygen, and then I can start to slow that down, take a little bit deeper breaths, take a little bit fuller exhales. If I'm laying down or if I'm seated on a bench, we want to make sure that these breaths are through the diaphragm. So I'm not all up in the shoulders and into the traps and elevating here, but getting into a full belly breath, thinking about a 360 degree expansion. And then start to get into that nasal breathing, get to a point where you can't even hear yourself breathe. And depending on how much time is left in class and kind of where you are throughout the workout, will probably help dictate how much time you spend trying to collect that breath back. And then in this particular case of team, we are looking at a 4 exercise B series. So we're not really taking a ton of rest in between exercises or even between our 3 sets. We're really just moving from one exercise to the other in a true circuit kind of HIIT style fashion. So in this case, we're probably going to end up going back to that power breathing as we move between exercises. And then during the exercises, generally speaking, we are going to inhale on either the pause at the top or pause at the bottom, depending on the movement. So if we're thinking a squatting pattern, we're probably going to inhale at the top, hold on the way down, exhale as we come back up. If we're thinking about a rowing pattern or a pull-up pattern, I'm gonna breathe in as my arms are long, and then I'm gonna exhale as I row up, and I'll probably end up holding that exhale or resetting my breath and breathing in during the eccentric as I lower the weight back to the floor. So it's gonna kind of depend on the movement, but again, I'd say nasal in, mouth out on that one. So nasal inhale, exhale through the mouth as we're breathing through certain exercises. The heavier the movement is, the more likely we are to use what's called the Valsalva maneuver, where we're maybe going to hold our breath. So if we're thinking heavy on the squats, or if we're thinking about strength, we can take a lot of these breathing techniques and move them over to the strength practices as well. So if I'm going 5 by 5 with a 5-second count on the way down, but it's a heavy squat pattern, I'm probably going to breathe in through the top, hold my breath through that 5-second eccentric, and then exhale as I try to stand back up and drive through that heavy weight. And then I'll just repeat that on reps 2, 3, 4, and 5. But that's a bunch of different breathing mechanisms that we can use both during an exercise, moving from one A series to the B series, or moving from one exercise to the next. But really, it's all about trying to get control of your breath, get it as close to we can as inhaling through the nose and exhaling through the nose, which is what we want to be while we're sleeping and through the majority of our day anyway. The next few questions are in regard to nutrition. So the first one asks, if we're coming to the early morning classes, what would we suggest that we eat before class? So just like if you were an athlete in high school or college and you had morning practice or an early game, one of the biggest questions that athletes ask, or one of the biggest things that we might coach an athlete up on, is how to fuel effectively before the game or practice. And what we don't want to do is me tell you like, hey, I want you to have a 4-egg omelet with a whole bunch of vegetables and some cheese, and you go and do that, and then you show up to the workout and your stomach's upset, you don't feel fueled, you feel like you need to go back home and take a nap, something like that, right? So this is going to be a little bit different for everybody, and I'd recommend starting really, really small and playing around with it. So start off with something like a protein shake. Start off with something like a banana, right? Something that, number one, it's going to end your fast for while you were sleeping. It's going to end that hopefully 7 to 8 hour fast that you had overnight. But two, it's going to top off your amino acid stores if we are supplementing with amino acids, or even a good protein shake. Just help get the body's protein levels back up so that we're not using muscle mass or protein as fuel, and also top off our carbohydrate stores with something like some type of fruit, banana, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, something like that, so that we have a little bit more energy going into that workout. Start off really small and test it out from there. So if you try a banana, try a protein shake, and everything feels fine, but you feel tired and you don't feel motivated, you feel like you're hungry, not necessarily by the end of the workout, but intra-workout, either try adding a little bit more of that same thing. We can go something to, like, if we don't have, a gluten problem, or if we eat bread, we can go with some sourdough bread. Again, good source of carbohydrate. It's a little bit less about the glycemic index on that because we are going right into a workout. So whatever types of carbohydrates or sugars we put into our body are pretty much going to be used right away. So I would start really small, play with it, but do things that you're comfortable with so that it doesn't impede your workout, and do just enough to get you through to the end of the workout so that you can go home and have a good full breakfast, replenishing everything that you lost both from the workout and overnight, as well as fueling you through the rest of your day until that next meal. My next nutrition question asks, what snack would we recommend if we're coming in to train 3 to 4 times per day? So if you're training 3 to 4 times per day, that's way too many. So stop doing that. Now, I'm going to assume that this person had a typo in the question and meant 3 to 4 times per week, in which case, yeah, you're probably going to need some snacks throughout the day. That's a pretty significant amount of training throughout the week, especially during a block like 10 sets of 10. I've already had members this first week coming in and saying that they are just ravenous after the workouts and throughout the week because the volume and the intensity is so much higher in a block like German volume training. So this is going to depend slightly on your goals. If your goal is to increase muscle mass and maybe gain a little bit of weight in the process, you're going to have a lot more leeway with what you snack on than if your goal is body composition oriented, in which case we probably want to keep snacking to a minimum, and then we're going to have to be a lot more thoughtful about the snacks that we use in order to continue to achieve our goal. So we'll kind of take this, I'll assume that we're probably looking more towards the body composition, losing weight route, just because that seems to be where most of our members usually are. And I'll just talk a little bit about the increasing muscle mass, gaining weight portion. So if we're looking at snacks throughout the day and our goal is to lose weight or improve our body composition, then protein shakes are a good option. I always tell everybody not to do, more than like one shake a day, or if you're doing one shake, no more than 2 scoops per shake, just because that gets a little bit, one, not very cost effective, and two, kind of gross to me. The shakes they're fine. They're not bad, but they're not great either. And I don't want to be having 3-4 protein shakes a day just to hit my protein intake. So protein shakes are good, but I keep them down to 1 a day. From there, we want to look at things that are potentially high protein and, in my opinion, probably lower on the glycemic index, lower sugar, lower carbohydrate. So there are some good options out there. Jerky's good. There's a brand out there called Epic that they have like jerky bars that, again, high protein, higher in fat, probably a little bit better for the people who are looking at losing weight, improving their body composition, and still looking for some type of snack in the middle of the day to kind of push them through to their next meal, fuel them for whatever they have coming up. Now, we have the nutrition blueprint videos, the habit videos that are in your Bridge app. The first one is on mindful eating, and there's a habit in there or a test in there that's the 10-minute snack test. And so essentially that test is grabbing 10 nuts of your choice. So I really like pistachios. So if I grab 10 pistachios and lay them out on a table, I'm going to set a timer for 1 minute. I'm going to have 1 pistachio for 1 minute. At the end of that 10 minutes, I'm going to ask myself, do I still want a snack? Am I still hungry? So this is really am I snacking because I'm bored, or am I snacking because I'm actually hungry and I want that next thing? And I think what we'll probably find is that for the most part, this test will be like, no, I wasn't really that hungry. I didn't need to go grab that whole bag of chips or whole box of cookies that is tempting me. And I just needed a little bit of something, and I can get on to my next thing and wait until my next meal to get my calories, my protein, my carbs, my fats. Now, if we're looking at gaining weight, we have a little bit more leeway here. We can snack a little bit more in between meals. We can even probably afford to eat something that's like a little bit higher in carbohydrates. So again, going back to our fruits conversation, going back to maybe like a protein bar or like a Lenny and Larry's protein cookie, something that's going to have a little bit more of a carbohydrate impact just because it fits our goals a little bit better. The other great snack that, no matter really what your goal is going to be vegetables. So if we think about our habits videos in our Bridge app, one of those habits is 7 to 8 servings of vegetables a day. Vegetables make a really good snack if you're thinking something like carrots, celery, cucumber, even like cherry tomatoes, and we can make an argument on whether or not cherry tomatoes or tomatoes in general should count as a fruit or a vegetable. But stuff like that is very low calorie, you're going to have a lot of it, and it's going to make you very full, on top of helping you get to those 7 to 8 servings of vegetables a day. And if you don't like those vegetables, get yourself a little bit of like hummus or something like that. Try to avoid something that's even higher calorie like peanut butter, but get yourself something to dip it in, even like some bitchin' sauce or something like that. Will all be, just fine as long as you don't overdo it with an insane amount of, dip per carrot. But that will hopefully help you tide over to the next meal. Another question that we had that I alluded to earlier was fueling for this block, team specifically with the 10 by 10. And it's really going to be the same answer as the snacking videos. It's going to depend on my answer to the snacking question is it's going to depend on what your goal is for the block. I think that this block, so German volume training, as well as our next 2 blocks to finish out the year, would be really good blocks for people who are looking to improve their body composition, especially going into a period like the holidays where we tend to eat a little bit more. Maybe we utilize this period leading up to it with these really hard training protocols to get our body composition down, get our body weight down a little bit, and try to create a little bit of a buffer there to these time periods where we might eat more. But if our goal is to lose weight, we're going to try not to snack. And even though we might be hungry, we're going to try to pick some lower carbohydrate snacks. If we are going to go carbohydrate, we're going to try to take fruits and vegetables in first before we do anything that's highly refined. If our goal is to gain weight, we can be a little bit more lenient with the carbohydrates that we choose. But yes, carbohydrates are going to be a little bit more of a fueling effect. However, that's going to be, again, goal dependent. My next few questions are very exercise specific. So the first one asks why we don't do the spinal segmentation series, specifically on our practice 3 movement prep prior to doing a hinging movement like RDLs and deadlifts. This is a really fair question. I can make a good argument for doing our spinal segmentation series before doing our hinging patterns in practice 3. And I could also make a really good argument for not doing our spinal segmentation series before those types of exercises. So I'll give them both to you, but just know at the end of the day that when we look at our practice 1, 2, and 3 cars, it's more about just trying to distribute movement across a broad spectrum of positions and warming up the joint by joint throughout all 3 movements than it is necessarily trying to match certain positions to certain days. So the reason why I wouldn't do a spinal segmentation or a spinal segmentation series prior to doing a RDL or a deadlift or some type of hip hinging pattern is that we want to create as much tension as possible through the torso to stabilize the spine in those hip hinging patterns. If I take the spine through its maximal amount of flexion and maximal amount of extension right before doing those hinging patterns, it's probably not going to lead to increased tension and increased stiffness throughout the spine. But that increased tension, increased stiffness, not allowing the spine to move on those hinging patterns is going to be what protects the spine during those heavy deadlifts, heavy RDLs, or really high volumes of those hinging patterns. So it's probably not something that I should include in the movement prep in order to get ready for those movements. Now, the counter argument there might be that, hey, if we can increase our end range strength in spinal extension and spinal flexion and more prepare ourselves to maybe get a little out of position on one of those deadlifts, the less likely we are to have a vertebrae pop out of place or something like that. And that would probably be the argument that you'd want to make. I'd say that mostly goes towards a healthy spine. So somebody who doesn't already know that they have a vertebrae that is slightly out of place or has never suffered from any type of low back pain. And frankly, low back pain, either chronic or acute, is the biggest injury or the most frequent injury that we see here training general population people who just train 3 to 4 times a week to look good, feel good, play good, on top of hanging out with their kids, playing golf, maybe working a desk job all day, just generally doing other things that already aren't great for the spine. So I'm going to pick the lowest risk option, which is probably to not train the spine through maximal flexion and extension on the same day that we are going to practice that hinge pattern. But that is one way to look at it is, well, if I can get stronger in max flexion, max extension of the spine, there's less risk of injury there, which may be the case for a very healthy spine. How do I know if I'm doing my RDLs correctly? I can't feel anything. And this person mentions that they ended up going heavier because they don't feel anything. Okay, so when we think about a movement like a RDL, it's a hip hinging pattern where our goal is to displace our hips, so push our hips as far back as we can. And we can think about getting our torso as close to our femur, our upper legs as we can, while maintaining that neutral spine that I talked about during that spinal segmentation question. So with this, we can think about our pelvis like a soup bowl. And we can think nice level soup bowl where none of the soup spills. We can think about a posterior pelvic tilt where the soup spills out the back. Or we can think about a anterior pelvic tilt where the soup spills out the front. Now, if we think about the low back has a lordotic curve, which means it's kind of concaved into extension. We want to maintain a little bit of that extension and push our butt back like we were trying to close a car door behind us, but our hands were full. I should feel a little bit of tension on my hamstrings here as I get, again, torso closer to the femur, keeping that neutral spine. Now, if we're somebody who has a lot of hamstring mobility, we might not feel quite the same tension on that hamstrings as we reach closer to the ground. even if we maintain a nice neutral spine. If that's you, and again, you have a healthy spine, one thing that we can do is think a little bit more anterior pelvic tilt as we reach our hips back. As we tilt that pelvis forward, we're putting the lumbar spine into more extension, which may not be the greatest thing for the low back, but if we don't have low back pain, we're probably going to be all right here because we're just leaning into more extension. As we do that, we're taking that bottom part of the pelvis and lifting it up, which is lengthening the hamstrings even further. So from there, I preload or pre-lengthen the hamstrings at the top and continue to push the hips back, meaning I might feel that stretch on the hamstrings even a little bit earlier. Now, if you're somebody who has low back pain or has had low back pain in the past, probably not what I'd recommend. But what I would look at is maybe looking in the mirror and trying to watch yourself hinge and seeing like, hey, am I flexing through my spine instead of pushing my butt backwards? If that's the case, then instead of feeling that hamstring stretch, we'll probably feel less. And then what we'll feel as we go through the concentric at the top is we're going to feel more of that low back do the work on the concentric portion of the lift, which isn't what we want. We want to feel hamstrings. We want to feel glutes. So that's all setting the movement up, and the eccentric portion, or the going down, the lowering towards the floor portion of that movement. Now on the way up, so we're starting at the bottom here. On the way up, what we want to think about is using that hamstring stretch that we now feel as like a rubber band to pull ourselves back up tall and push the hips forward. And that's exactly what I want to think about here, is pushing the hips forward. We don't want to initiate that movement with our shoulders. We want to initiate that movement just like we did going down, driving the hips back by driving the hips forward. So the torso should remain rigid the whole time. Straight line from our shoulder down to our hip. Look for that hamstring stretch at the bottom, however you need to find it. And then use that stretch like a rubber band. Pull yourself back up tall and push the hips forward. Another way that we could work to feel our hamstrings and our glutes a little bit more on an RDL, or just change that hinge pattern a little bit better, would be to go toes elevated, which is actually something we're doing in our team class right now. So by elevating our toes, we do two things. The first one being we're shifting our weight backwards. We're putting our weight in our heels. Now, more organically than if our feet were flat on the floor, what this does is it makes us want to shift our hips backwards to balance our center of gravity better. So it puts us in a better position to train that hinge more organically than if our feet are flat on the ground and my center of gravity is more over my forefoot. The other thing that this is going to do is just by putting us in more ankle dorsiflexion, it lengthens that whole posterior chain. So one thing that our team members may find right now is that they might not be able to get to the same depth on a toes elevated dumbbell RDL that they could get with a feet flat on the ground dumbbell RDL. And that's because the posterior chain has more length to it, or it's pre-lengthened here. So really very similar to that conversation I had about just using a little bit more anterior pelvic tilt, we could get out of elevating our toes. So it's a really good teaching tool, and it's a good way for teaching somebody who might have excessive hamstring length to feel their RDL or feel their hamstrings through a hinging pattern. I have two questions here that are in regards to a lateral squatting pattern. The first one asks, how do you improve the range of motion on a lateral squat? The following question talks about having a strained or a sprained ankle and how to modify the lateral squat for better results. And I actually have even a third question on the lateral squat on whether it's more important to increase the weight or increase the range of motion on the lateral squat. A bunch of questions about lateral squats here. So probably the easiest one to answer right off the bat is if I have an ankle mobility issue, or I have an impingement, or I have ankle pain going through any type of squatting pattern, my answer would be don't push through pain. So if I take that wide stance and I start to drive that knee forward, I only want to push it as far forward as I can without getting that pain in the top side of my foot. If this is a problem for you, number one, go see a PT, go see somebody who can actually put their hands on you and maybe feel what's going on in there. And while you're coming to Allegit, ask for one of our regressions. It's probably going to be a mobility exercise instead of the lateral squat. So we'll probably have you down on the ground kicking one leg out to the side and going through some type of a liftoff pattern to try and get more abduction out of that hip, which in the long run will lead to more range of motion when we get you back out of pain doing those lateral squats. So to answer the second question on whether or not we want to worry about loading this movement heavy or adding more range, at the end of the day, the answer is going to be both, but we want to add range first, right? So just like with all of our squatting patterns on this, we want to think about pushing the knee forward, keeping that torso upright, and trying to find a position where the hamstring covers the calf at the bottom, and then pushing ourselves back up tall the same way that we come up is what we went down. So once we get that added range of motion, then we can worry about adding the load, because adding the load is going to be what helps increase the size of the muscle or add lean mass. When we think about increasing our range of motion, number one, the stance we take is going to matter. And this is an exercise that has a pretty small bandwidth of having our feet too far apart and having our feet too close together. If we have our feet too close together, my center of gravity gets outside my foot, and I can't really figure out how to navigate how to get lower. Versus if I take way too wide of a stance, now my center of gravity never gets over that foot. I just feel a gigantic adductor or groin stretch on that opposite side. My knee is now going into valgus on this side, and it's just not as pretty of a movement. So we really have to figure out what the best foot placement is here to get started. And then from here, we think about, again, chest is up. The easiest way to do any of these movements is going to be a hands in front kind of counterbalance position here. So that hands in front is going to really let me push my knee forward, sit my hips back a little bit further, and just balance everything out so I can maximize my range of motion as I go down and as I come up. As we add load here and distribute those dumbbells kind of underneath our hips with our center of gravity, it's going to challenge our movement pattern. It's going to challenge our coordination a little bit differently than if the hands were in front, in addition to adding external load, right? So we might lose a little bit of range of motion depending on where we put those dumbbells, but our goal is still chest up, knee forward, hamstring covers the calf at the bottom. So trying to get down there as much as you can before we worry about adding load, or if we go up one week and we're like, man, I don't feel like I'm getting that same stretch on the opposite side. I don't feel like I'm getting the same depth. Probably better to go down a little bit, use some of the either change plates or magnets to micro load up, but always worry about range of motion overload first. Now, some of the other things that we can do is we can look at that straight leg, maybe pick that toe up off the ground, pivot a little bit on that heel. Technically, that's a little bit different movement than a lateral squat. You're getting more into what we call a Cossack squat, but it's a good way to kind of overload, add a little bit more range on that side without that straight leg being your limiting factor at the bottom there. So always go range of motion over load first. First add the range, then add the load. Don't push through pain. Lateral squat is a tough movement for a lot of people. It's in what's called the frontal plane. It's not a plane that we as humans move in very often. It is very valuable to train though, because we're not there very often. When we are there, it increases our risk of injury. So it's something that we should spend time on, but just know that you're not the only person who feels this way. I got 3 questions in a row on this Ask Me Anything, all about this lateral squat. So just keep working at it. Keep coming in 3 days a week. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And the last question is, how can somebody improve their front rack position for a movement like front squats? So essentially, to prep for the front squat or improve our front rack position without using a bench, we can just use the bar within the rack. So depending on how tight of a squeeze I want to take here is going to depend on how much of that wrist extension I have. Open hand, less grip on the bar, probably means I have less wrist extension. So if I just go fingertips on the bar, but even without picking the bar up, just try to lift my elbows as high as I can, that's going to get a pretty, very specific stretch that I'm looking for on that front rack position, while also working on getting those elbows up in deep elbow flexion, which is exactly what we want out of the front squat. And the more that I close my hands up, the tighter grip I take on the bar, the less I'm probably going to be able to push my elbows up, in addition to the less of a stretch I'm probably going to feel on that forearm. So a big part of what you're feeling as the person who asked this question as far as improving your front rack position probably has just as much to do as the weight that you're choosing to use on your front squats as it does your actual wrist mobility, right? So first of all, when I teach somebody how to front squat, I don't ever teach them to take a tight grip on the bar. I really only need fingertips on here in order to push that bar up against my shoulders and keep it there the whole time. Now from there, if we start to go through our 10 sets of 10 and we start to get tired or the weight's too heavy and I end up coming forward, that's going to put that bar more on my fingertips, which is going to push my wrist further back into extension and increase the amount of stretch that I feel on my forearm, which might be why you think your front rack position sucks or you need to improve your mobility, but that's probably not the case at all. I find that with the bar, most people can get into that front rack position. It's just their torso and their hips are getting out of position during the movement, increasing the load on your hands or your wrists. In which case, the best option is probably just to go down in weight and do the movement biomechanically more correct.